I am kind of in a state where I can't remember things properly. Even if
Hmm.
I do remember them now, after half an hour, they're gone. Why is that?
Okay, very very interesting question. I'm going to answer that, provide some thoughts on that within the context of one assumption, which is that the question is being asked in the context of someone who's recovering from pornography addiction or a similar addiction. So with that assumption in mind, um, I think it's interesting because um, the recovery process when it comes to addiction involves so many elements within our brains that it's really interesting how the brain can have different kinds of responses to stimulus. Um, Sometimes they're conscious, sometimes they're subconscious. Um, so something that's interesting is um, the way the brain can attempt to cope with something negative. What's interesting is that the brain can heal over time, as many of you are familiar with. There's a term called neuroplasticity, where that basically means that the brain can literally mold itself. It can form new connections, neural connections that are healing in terms of the ability to process thoughts and emotions differently and form new patterns of thoughts and behaviors and so forth. Um, Along with that idea, the brain is also going to look for ways to, again, as I said just a second ago, cope with the challenges that it's facing. Um, so, for example, if we become, I'll use kind of an analogy here. If we become overly stimulated, for example, overly stressed out, um, the brain has the ability to sort of say, okay, I'm overloaded, I can't handle anymore, I'm going to shut down. And it's a protection, it's a self-preservation mechanism that can be built into our brain processes. So many of you have heard of the term fight or flight. Um, in kind of a similar way, that can be sort of a flight from an excess of stress or an excess of fear or anxiety, depression, things like that, where the brain can literally cause certain functions to be repressed. Memory, um, interestingly enough, as I mentioned a few minutes ago, is housed within the limbic part of the brain again, as I mentioned. And so, with it being housed there, it's interesting how, because emotions and instinctual drives are all part of that same limbic system, it can seek to self preserve by doing certain things that we may or may not even be aware of. One possibility is that your brain could be saying, okay, I've got too much to think about. I can't handle this or that and the other. I'm overwhelmed and I need to protect myself. And so memory problems may be something that could result from that. And you'll often see people who are struggling with an immense addictive behavior in their life will generally have some other concern, some other issue that is presenting itself as well in terms of the mental health status, such as depression or anxiety, or maybe there's some emotional issues like lack of self-confidence. Things like that can come into play very much. Irritability, those kinds of things can present themselves as well. And so there are some symptoms, if you will, of the brain trying to protect itself and trying to deal with some of those factors. And so it could be that there's something to that regarding short-term memory issues, being overstimulated, trying to protect itself, that kind of a thing. The brain does a lot of remarkable things, and so it'd be interesting to talk more about that and kind of learn more about what that individual is experiencing. But that's definitely one of the things to think about.